Yo, why do
Thank you very much, Terry, and good evening to our esteemed panel, and of course to our audience. Now, you know what they say, you save the best for last, right? So gentlemen, you ought to feel very privileged to be a part of this ultimate session for the evening. And for those of you who are still here, I noticed that some people left. I know you're tired, you already ate, you've been through an entire day of presentations and panels and discussions and questions. So I just want to invite you at this moment to just slap the person to your left, wake them up. Joke. All right, how I'm really gonna wake you up this evening is by talking about something very sexy. Impact investing, rah! Woo! Very, very sexy, right? I was asked just backstage if in my many, many interviews I've ever discussed impact investing, and I said, nope. Very, very first time, I had to actually go Google and see what it was all about. And gentlemen, as we discuss impact investing this evening, I think it's one of those gray areas that's recently, or maybe not so recently, gotten a name. Because we understand here in the Caribbean and perhaps elsewhere, we understand for-profit, right? You guys definitely understand what business for profit is, the base of capitalism. And we understand non-profit, not for profit. So you're either doing something for profit or not for profit. And there's little understanding of what comes in between, such as impact investing. You have your ESG goals that many companies are setting now, social entrepreneurship. So I want to start by asking all three of you to give your experience with what impact investing can look like. And I'm gonna leave Ladell for last since you just gave a presentation talking about what it's done for you already. And let's start with James in the middle.
Well, thank you for being here with us this late. Thanks for the invitation. Super happy to be here, especially to discuss this topic that I'm super passionate about and very genuine. Impact investing, as I thought about preparing for today, I thought exactly what you described. Impact investing in the Caribbean circles. It's associated with not-for-profit, with the philanthropic sector, and it's really neither. It's really a mindset about looking at investments through a focus of, aside from a financial return, does it make a difference to address the inequalities that exist in the markets we cover. So in a region that is populated by the great majority of people who fall way below the average GDP per capita that you're used to seeing in the US, it's somewhere where we should really embrace it and think about it, because it's no different. It's not something that stands different. It's really everything that was discussed today. It's impact investing. The difference is that in the formal sector, you measure it. You want the financial return that I just heard, that BlackRock has targeted for their fund, 12%. That sounds pretty reasonable to me compared to alternatives. But yet, they will be intentional about making sure that every investment that returns at least 12% on average will also make a huge difference for populations, for the climate that is in grave need of being intentional about moving the needle substantially.
And Lucas, from a multilateral perspective, what are you looking for in impact investing projects?
Thank you, Kalila. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Only one point, I'm very disappointed that the holiday picture that I had provided has not made it to the screen. I wanted to bolster my Jamaican credentials, and it turned out that the only picture that I had available was one that I had taken. It was, embarrassingly enough, more than 7 years ago, so it probably didn't look like me anymore, but it had been taken in Ocho Rios, so I was like, how appropriate, this is the one that I'm going to be showing, but it never made it to the screen. So I have been to Jamaica, but it has been to the other side of the island. Thank you for inviting me, and what a wise man recently told me was that people don't remember what you say, they remember how you make them feel. So, and this is a topic that I feel, and we as an institution, IDB Invest, we are the private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. investing in sustainability in Latin American and the Caribbean. And what I was saying to James when I saw you earlier is we've been doing impact investing in one form or another for the past 60 years as an institution, and suddenly we sit next to Ladell from BlackRock, and he's basically given my presentation, which is amazing, and it I think resonates, or it reinforces the message: we cannot do this alone by any stretch. For us, impact investing is not any different from the way that you just described it 5 minutes ago. We focus on the traditional infrastructure, financial sector, corporates, and in each and every one of those items we seek to support items of climate. We work on inclusion, gender, SMEs, and digitalization to simplify matters. For me, I invest in funds, as I told you earlier on. The real impact, although you can boil it down to the technical assistance we provide, you can boil it down to blended finance that we provide to some of our projects. In the end, it is in the people that we do our projects with. And the most successful ones and the most impactful ones have been those where I have been able to find and gain the trust of my partners in the fund managers that I worked with and in the people that we eventually were able to reach. We invested here in the Caribbean with Portland Group, one of the earlier fund managers active in the Caribbean. The fund was launched in 2016. Currently a portfolio of 22,000 people employed throughout the Caribbean, and one of them being Yanni, who was speaking earlier. So too much to mention, but my main message is we can't do it alone, and we have to mobilize everyone to be able to gain the impact that we seek to have. So thank you.
Right. So certainly, impact investing is not new to IDB, not new to multilaterals. You guys always want to have some type of social impact in what you choose to lend to. For private sector though, Ladell, I heard you mention the 12% return that you're looking on average. How do you measure the impact that you are striving for?
Great question. So, can you all hear me okay? Okay. So for every investment, we use a framework called the Impact Management Project Framework. And that basically helps you essentially look at what they classify as the 5 dimensions of impact. So as I mentioned earlier, beyond the economic underwrite for an investment, we also take every deal and we apply the IMP framework process. And in summary, we're just trying to figure out, we have an impact thesis, and that impact thesis first, how much impact are we going to generate? How is that going to be measured? Who are we impacting? What is the risk associated with that impact? And what is the ultimate level of contribution? And some of that that work will often result in a handful of KPIs that are essentially aligned with the impact thesis, and in many cases, indeed, aligned with what the actual business or project does, which is why we're making the investment in the first place. And we look to track that information on either a quarterly or an annual basis, depending on what it is we're looking to serve.
So do you tie because I know like with IDB and some other lenders, they tie the next payment to the delivery of some of those KPIs. So is that the same in the private sector?
It can happen. So there are a number of products that have been raised, not necessarily by BlackRock, but in the market in general, where if you are able to generate some level of impact or take some level of approach, there could be a discount, for example, on the rate that you may pay. Or if you're investing alongside a particular strategy, it may be a lower cost of capital from the outset in order to incentivize you to have that impact. Out of the 6 deals that we've done so far, there's only been one situation where we basically tied the generation of impact to essentially extra compensation that we would pay to our co-investment partner, because they are the lead investor on a transaction. And we essentially said, we've agreed to impact KPIs, you're the lead investor. If you deliver that performance, there could be extra economics for you. So it does happen, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
Yeah, I think most of us in this room are familiar with tests. Now, I remember the IMF test, the famous test. You pass the test, you get the next level, you get that unlocked. So James, traditionally, we have seen many sectors be underrepresented in terms of the funding that they're able to get, and also leadership. So we see underrepresentation, and Liddell alluded to it in his presentation as well. We see underrepresentation in leadership, we see underrepresentation in assets under management, and so many different areas. So what are your ideas to unlock reasonable capital allocations by some of these lending partners to emerging Caribbean-based fund managers and companies like Sygnus?
Great angle to ask about. Well, I'll give you some context that I shared last night with Liddell that I read recently from our largest investor in one of our impact funds, Calvert Impact. She states that in the US alone, impact-aligned sustainable funds account for $17 trillion. You can ask the audience, how much of that you think has been allocated to anywhere in the Caribbean? And I can assure you, it's next to nothing, if anything, or formally. So that tells you the magnitude of how underinvested this market is when it comes to the formality of impact investing and the possibilities. Because just think about population alone in terms of percentage. When you compare it to the U.S. population, if only 0.5%, even 0.25% of $17 trillion gets allocated to companies like Sygnus and the rest of the sector, which, by the way, didn't go unnoticed for me in one of the earlier Fireside chats, that one of the gentlemen mentioned 10 years ago he wouldn't have a choice. If the bank weren't there, he wouldn't have a choice. So that's what's happening, right? All of a sudden you have Sygnus and other players, as I've heard Barris mention, that are developing, and that is absolutely necessary for larger players like BlackRock, like Calvert that's supporting us, to have a channel to be able to allocate some of that capital. And credibility and trajectory is really important. So I think we're in the right direction. It's minuscule, the amount of money that has been allocated, but now we are at the beginnings of a potential change where a small allocation will make a huge transformational difference for the markets that we cover.
So Lucas, what are you looking for when someone comes to you with a proposal and they say, I need X dollars to make this investment? And I'm sure the icing on the cake is when they say it's going to create so many jobs, it's going to have an impact on this community. But what specifically are you looking for? What would give somebody the leg up or the advantage in approaching someone for funding?
Well, it is a difficult question, Kalila, because in the end it is, from my perspective, usually you're entering into almost what is a marriage, and it can be a dysfunctional one or a happy one, and it's up to me to decide whether I'm going to be going into this relationship. And aside from the KPIs and the buzzwords, which change on a frequent basis, I am looking for, and this sounds corny, but I'm looking for a genuine commitment to realize the sustainable development that the people claim to realize. And to a certain extent, I feel that problems in any investment, but particularly in the complicated markets that we operate in, are inevitable, and I'm almost of the philosophy that you may as well just start investing, acknowledge the problems that you're going to be facing, and if you have the right team and if you have the right attitude, you stand a good chance, and I will support that. So what I also, for this audience, what I eventually would like to accomplish is make life easier for those fund managers who lack the traditional experience that people usually require. And since there's so little institutional capital going into the Caribbean region in particular, I feel that it is our role to, if we want to support the asset class, I want to work together with Audrey from Karaya. I'm not sure if she's in the audience, but there she is. Peter is sitting next to her. He's done it for the IFC in many years, and successfully so, and that's what I'm looking for. So if there are any first-time fund managers, please call me. Barris has my phone number, and we'll address the problems as they come up. That's all I can promise.
Are there any specific priority areas?
The Caribbean, in and of itself, is of high priority to IDB Invest and IDB as a group.
So, Ladell, I heard in your presentation, you said priority for BlackRock when it comes to impact investing. You mentioned education, financial literacy, and a few others as well. But what you also mentioned, and I heard some reaction from the crowd, is that at this point, the funds are not available for investment in the Caribbean. So what would it take for BlackRock to consider funds for investment in the Caribbean?
Sure. Well, there actually is one fund within alternatives that I'm aware of that I mentioned, the Climate Finance Partners. But I think what it's ultimately going to take is the points that the Honorable Minister mentioned earlier today. I think what the Caribbean has to do is to convince the global market that enabling environments are being created for businesses to thrive. That is the first part. Then I think the second part is the domestic industry. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed hearing about today and asking questions over last night and over lunch about the founding of Sygnus is the domestic industry being that first capital in to essentially establish proof points that returns can be generated. Then I think is how you communicate those 2 points to the broader world and basically show that there's a large market where capital can be put to work, generate returns, be returned, and you could do it over and over again. And we also have to be ambitious about the size of capital that we're looking for. Sometimes I think, and I'm just going to speak from the heart here, I think sometimes as Black people, we set too small an expectation for ourselves. And as a result, thank you, we will go out and we will say, I want to raise 20 million or a $50 million fund. But when you're going to talk to a large institutional investor, you're not solving their problem. Like, it's a waste of time for them to look at a $50 million fund. So you have to show we could put billions of capital to work in these particular areas, and it can be done effectively. So then it's worth my time to look at, $100 million commitment to one particular fund. And so that's what I think has to occur. And then I make one last point, and it's actually related to the question that James mentioned. We also have to be very strategic, or that you asked James. We have to be very strategic. There are talented people from the Caribbean that are in the financial services industry globally. We've got to get those people into the right seats where they can be allocators of capital, because this is a relationship-driven game. And what ultimately happens, if you want to get BlackRock to move, is let's just assume that the pension fund manager for the state of Connecticut is from the Caribbean. And the pension fund manager is looking at BlackRock and all of the accounts, and he's saying, why don't don't we have any exposure in the Caribbean? Because I'm looking at data that is generating returns. BlackRock will move. Other institutions will move, but it speaks to the importance of let's get our people in seats where they can become capital allocators. And I think that's how we really bring to power, you know, the talent that exists in our communities.
That's a great point. I love how you explained how a lot of minority groups, especially black people, we just aren't thinking big enough. And I think women face a very similar hurdle. Women tend to undervalue ourselves. It's unfortunate that Jennifer couldn't make it today because I was very interested in hearing her perspectives on all of this. But, well, let me ask the men. James, what can women do to position ourselves, because I'm one of woman folk, obviously. What can women do to position ourselves in terms of getting or attracting more funding for projects that we may need to see an impact on the female community? That's half of the world, half of the global population.
Great question, and I'm super passionate about the inclusion or beyond the inclusion of women in this sector, because I think, and I'll give it another stat, less than 5% of all the wealth being managed in the U.S. is managed by minorities, which includes all women of all colors.
Interesting that you put women along with minorities.
I think it's 97%. So, don't you think decisioning would be different if 50% of the women were managing, 50% of the managers were women? I bet there would be a mix of, capital will be deployed differently because we would, just the diversity, it's phenomenal. So I think men have to open that up, help, facilitate, the lady, the teacher who was, I think she left, I thought it was phenomenal when she brought up, what can I do with my students? This sector is grossly underknown. I didn't know anything about the sector, and I went to an Ivy League, and I graduated from an Ivy League, and I didn't wake up to the fund management sector until I became an entrepreneur. Actually, after Hurricane Maria, that I kept hearing about impact, and I think that's how I got into the fund management space. But so think about it, and I went to an Ivy League school. So when you say that less than 3% of the monies in the U.S., the wealthiest country in the world, is managed by minorities, which includes all women. So what if we start educating them early about what difference this sector could do? Because, by the way, this brings me back to the founders of Sygnus. They don't realize it, but Gazan's investment was an impact investment. You know how few. They are one of so few managers in existence in the Caribbean. The sector is incredibly underdeveloped. So anyway, it brings me back to the fact that that's men of color, but women is even more accentuated. So anyway, I'm super passionate about the fight about women. So.
Good. Well, I guess I asked the right person then. So Lucas, final question goes to you, and I think we have some time for questions as well. We heard Liddell in his presentation speak to that. This is not concessionary rates. You do expect a reasonable return. At IDB, you do offer concessionary rates on some things. What is the ideal balance of purpose and profit?
We have, ever since we set up IDB Invest as a separate private sector branch, we've always had a dual mission statement. And in every project, we seek to find the right balance. But I think our approach, to answer your question more adequately, is to look at it on a portfolio basis, because we feel that some projects probably are justifiable because of the significant impact, and maybe we could accept them with a slightly lower expected return to be compensated by another one that has the reverse. So, and that really is the only way to do it, because our region is so diverse that you really couldn't approach it with a one-size-fits-all strategy. I think we all have the same mindset, and we have to look at it on a portfolio basis.
I see we have a question here. What is the outlook on investing in, may I ask the person who's operating it to just scroll up for me, please? Yes. What is the outlook on investing in developing utility scale renewable energy projects, particularly solar, within Jamaica and the wider Caribbean and Latin America? Who wants to take that? Any volunteers? All right.
So I'll start. I think the outlook is huge, and it ties into the remarks that I made earlier today about the 100 trillion that is going to go towards transition to net zero. I mean, if I were going to ask the Honorable Minister here earlier, I would have said one of those funds that he's looking to support SMEs or other businesses, maybe consider a third one that is focused on transition to net zero and backing renewable projects, because there's so much capital that's lining up to flow towards transition to net zero. You're almost attaching to the quote unquote money in motion. And so I think that if the countries within the Caribbean begin to talk about their efforts to transition to net zero based economies, and you have operators or developers of utility scale solar projects and other forms of renewable energy, and you can prove that you can execute on those projects, I think you'll be overwhelmed by the response of capital providers wanting to attach onto it.
Do you have any more questions? We have a question from the audience. All right, just stand up and ask your question.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm testing. Okay, great. Okay, so good afternoon again, everyone. I'm Avon Prendergast from Sygnus Capital. I'm an analyst at Sygnus Capital, and I have a question for Ladell. So the question is, you mentioned that over the next 3 decades, there is an over 100 trillion US dollars investment opportunity going into infrastructure development, which includes carbonization, digitization, etc. What do you see as some of the barriers preventing some of that capital from flowing into the Caribbean, specifically Jamaica? And do you think that there are any kind of legislative changes that we could make to make it easier for that capital to flow into the region? Thank you. Yeah.
Sure. So I'm not an expert enough on, most of what I've learned about the legislative environment for investing in Jamaica, I've learned today. So I'm not an expert on the rules and regulations around investing in Jamaica. But what I would say is it all goes back to the comment that I made earlier about creating an enabling environment, which is why I think what the Honorable Minister mentioned earlier when he talked about trying to create an environment where the country is just more resilient to economic shocks, I think is one step towards that. And so I just sincerely believe that countries within the Caribbean, Jamaica and specifically, if you create that environment and then you go out and communicate to people how that environment is occurring, the investment policies, all of the support to try and facilitate investment, and you show early stages of proof points, you will just be surprised at the capital that will ultimately come. But this is a long game. You know, I often tell people that when I was an entrepreneur, and even now being on the other side as a capital allocator, I feel like it's like when you're starting to date as a teenager, right? You're approaching people and you just get rejected all the time. Well, at least I did. I'll talk about myself. You just get rejected. And then somebody's like, I see the potential, you know, I want to be a part of this. And that's what just has to keep occurring. So we just have to keep after it and put in place the environment that shows that capital can come here and flourish, and it'll work out.
We have another question from our online viewers.
Scale managers.
It's given the backlash towards ESG investing due to inaccurate reporting and lack of comparability, is there any concern? Can you scroll up for me, please? Let me see the rest of the question. Is there any concern that there won't be a full buy-in for impact/ESG investing? Anyone want to take that one?
Well, I mean, it's a tricky topic. No,
I'll give you a simple answer. Yes, there are some people who are greenwashing and not doing the right thing. This is just too big. And there are too many people who care genuinely, and there are too many people like Adele and everyone who's invested with them, and the people who are invested with us and the IDB, for this to make a difference. This is noise.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more. As I said earlier, there's no time to waste. This climate topic is on top of every agenda, as it should be, and it's inevitable that we'll come across some of that, but in the grand scheme of things, this is where we should be focusing.
ESG has been politicized, but at the end of the day, do people genuinely not care about the environment? Most people do. Do people not care about overlooked SMEs everywhere? Right. Do people not care about the fact that there's so few women in positions that matter? That's just noise.
And what I would also say is that it's become so mainstream. I mean, we just see it in every page of the presentation that Ladell was just giving us, and it has become impossible for any project or any investor or any sponsor to raise funds without a credible sustainability or ESG strategy, and therefore I think that becomes much less of an issue.
And I'll just add, the asset class by some measures is growing over 30% per annum. So it might be growing as fast, if not faster, than private credit. And one of the underlying enablers are young people. Because I recently read some reports at Fundfire that in an investor survey, for people below the age of 35, knowing what companies do, how their capital is actually helping to address problems in society is an important part of their decision to either invest in a fund or actually support a company. And so it's hard to, in summary, see how we back away from it, although it has become politicized and there is the greenwashing that was mentioned earlier.
I'll follow up on a message here. Millennials are due to inherit over $30 trillion. They care a lot.
I keep hearing that statistic indeed. I wonder how much trillion can come to me. Well, that's going to do it for this session. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Excuse me. Sorry.
Oh, another question.
You have a question at the back?
I do.
All right, last question.
I'd just like to congratulate the Sygnus team for a very well executed event. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Can we give them a round of applause again, please? So this is just actually a statement and a question. So the statement is for Mr. Robbins, and the question is for Mr. Connor. Mr. Robbins, I actually a former schoolmate of mine in Jamaica. I believe is a former managing director at BlackRock or is currently working there. So I'd love to speak to you after about that, maybe just reconnecting with him and seeing what conversations could be started. And Mr. Connor, I was just wondering, in light of the devastation that Hurricane Fiona has caused on Puerto Rico, I was wondering what, in terms of impact investing, like where does Puerto Rico go from here? Like what we can do in the Caribbean to support our brothers and sisters there. I studied in Cuba, so I would love to see with the Spanish that I do I have left over, how I could possibly participate in recovery efforts.
Super. Well, thank you for the question, and thanks for caring and for bringing it up. I go back to, we started our impact fund management platform in the darkness after Hurricane Maria. So these are the moments where sometimes you connect the dots. And Hurricane Fiona, thanks a lot. Thank God. It wasn't as bad as Maria. Clearly, lots of flooding, lots of people who were impacted. But our mission from that point forward, it goes without any deviation. We're committed to it. through every hurricane, through every earthquake that we see out there. And again, I'll go back to when it comes to the region. There's a huge need for this sector to be developed, for more managers, for more women managers to develop, for more money to be allocated, and that will basically help the entire region, because you have funds transfers in the philanthropy, but the most powerful thing about the impact sector is that it's privately deployed. You know, you have all these private sector people who care putting money to work. In the combination of making sure that money doesn't get lost is the number one rule of impact investing. Protection of capital, and then the right return for the right risk, for the risk you're taking. Because the reality is, we're facing tons of risks. You know, hurricanes happen. You know, businesses go south, and that's a reality. So it's about doing the right thing while recognizing that you're putting other people's money in harm's way. So, and it's just an educational process that I believe, you know, with the emergence of Sygnus, the other fund managers that I don't know, but I've learned today that the sector is developing, I think Jamaica is representative of what could happen everywhere around the Caribbean, so including Cuba and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has a very underdeveloped alternative investment sector. So.
All right, thank you very much for that question, and thank you, Ladell, thank you, James, thank you, Lucas.